At the beginning of my sabbatical on April 1st, I didn't have a garden. This was a problem for me because my sabbatical was supposed to be something about an experience of communion that was enriched both through its setting in a garden and by enjoying the literal fruits of a garden. Throughout the first several weeks, we were doing things like having a concrete pad poured for the table and chairs, and where we still intend to build a pergola, relocating walkways, removing 1-inch California gold rock and a cactus garden, disassembling raised beds and raking down the soil in them, installing irrigation, and spreading compost. All of this needed to be done before I could begin to sow seeds and sink plants in the ground. And in the meantime, I chafed. I was full of anxiety, and I couldn't sleep. The garden wasn't producing. I didn't even have a garden to produce anything. How in the world was I going to work on this communion project that's supposed to be set in a garden if I have no garden? But then it dawned on me that I did have some perennial herbs in the back. I could make something with the herbs. And in the back of the sanctuary, on one of the tables, you can see some of the sabbatical artifacts in my little collection, and you can see some of the things that I made. And those things will be on display through next week, World Communion Sunday. So, at this time, in those first several weeks, I saw my garden as a means to an end. And my own transformation wouldn't happen until that perspective changed. The nature of perspectives and relationships is also the central issue in the book of Job. Today, as Jerry noted, is the first Sunday of a mini preaching series on Job. We'll pause next week for World Communion Sunday and then spend the rest of October with Job and the question, does Job serve God for nothing? Or is he only in it to get something out of it? Our text for today introduces the story and provides the reader with some background information that Job is never privy to. A solid Bible study provides us with some helpful reading tips as we begin this time with Job. We'll start with the setting. Commentators often say that the book of Job begins in a somewhat fairy tale-like fashion. Long ago, in a land far away called Uz, there lived a blameless and upright man named Job. Adding to the mystique, no one really knows where this land of Uz actually is, or if it even really existed. And then there's the date of composition, when the book was written. Scholars are totally undecided. Maybe 4,000 years ago, maybe 2,600 years ago, give or take a few years. Somewhere around there. It's also a bit oddly constructed. The beginning and end have this mythic storytelling vibe, written in prose, but the other 39 odd chapters are written in poetry. Really challenging poetry. Maybe not quite like reading Shakespeare, but maybe more like reading Shakespeare than a nursery rhyme. Since the part of Job we're starting with today is just the first verse of chapter 1, and then the first 10 verses of chapter 2, it may help for me to fill in the gap of what happens in the rest of chapter 1 so that we have a little more context for what happens in our text for today at the beginning of chapter 2. So in chapter 1, the portrait of Job that is painted is as an archetypal patriarch, someone along the lines of the great patriarchs of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're told that he had 7 sons, 3 daughters, and owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and, quote, a vast number of servants, so that he was greater than all the people of the East, end quote. We learned all of this in verse 2. Despite some commentators wanting to paint Job as an everyman, a human representative that everyone can relate to, Job is a man of enormous privilege. A man of Job's stature would be greatly honored among his peers. Everyone would come to him for advice, wisdom, and to settle their disputes. And by all accounts, he was truly a blameless and upright man. The Hebrew word here is tam, T-A-M, tam, which means integrity. He was a man of integrity. And his integrity went so far that it wasn't enough for Job just to keep his own nose clean. He also made sacrifices on behalf of his children unless they sin. This was part of his responsibility as a patriarch, as an older male head of a household, to maintain family and social order. The portrait of Job's character is abruptly interrupted when the scene changes and we find ourselves in the heavenly court with the divine beings who came to present themselves before the Lord. The scene depicted is a routine one from a time when rulers sent out representatives to survey the land, and then they return and report on the happenings in their own individual districts. Among the emissaries is the Satan. Now, you may recall other times when I have mentioned this figure. Here in the book of Job, there's no red devil with horns and a pitchfork. The Satan is translated as the adversary or the accuser. We might think of something like a prosecuting attorney. It is not a name. It's a job description. God asks where the adversary has been. The adversary replies, wandering around the earth. And God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" God boasts that there's no one like him who is of absolute integrity. And the adversary's reply is the fundamental question that the book of Job revolves around. Does Job revere God for nothing? The adversary goes on. We might even say provokes God by saying, "Look how good you've made life for Job, greatest man of the East. Of course he reveres you. Take it all away, though, and Job will curse you to your face." God accepts the wager and says, "Fine, take it all away. Only don't harm him." And so, all the oxen and donkeys and sheep and camels and servants, and even Job's children, all gone. And how does Job respond? Piously. He tears his clothes, shaves his head, and falls to the ground and worships God. He remains a man who is upright and blameless. All this has happened just before our text today. But it should sound familiar because we have the same exact setup as we begin chapter 2. Court is in session, and the divine beings present themselves before the Lord. The exchange between God and the adversary begins in a similar fashion, only this time God boasts that Job has not been turned against God in his suffering. And the adversary says, skin for skin. People will give up everything they have in exchange for their own lives, but stretch out your hand and strike his bones and flesh, and he will definitely curse you to your face. God says, "You have the power to do this. Go do it." And the adversary goes and does it. At this point, Job's wife speaks. We don't know her name. She has the tiniest speaking part, but of course that doesn't prevent mostly male commentators from having loads to say about her over the years. We don't have much time to spend with her this morning, but I do find it interesting when Carol Newsom points out in the Women's Bible Commentary that after Job's wife speaks, Job is silent for 7 days. And the next time he speaks, in chapter 3, his words sound curiously like hers. Has she spoken a deeper truth to him? One that he was unable to acknowledge previously because he was so wrapped up in his own honor and integrity? Maybe. But our passage today ends with her words. So a few considerations for us on this first of 4 Sundays with Job. The first is a caution. how we read Job is everything. If we read it looking for empirical data about an historical figure, we're going to have to twist ourselves into a pretzel to get there. Rather, as Carol Newsom says, Job is more like a parable or a thought experiment. If we read it expecting to find an answer to why we suffer, like Job's friends, we're going to be disappointed. Most of us will identify with Job, and like him, we desperately want to know why we suffer. What is the meaning? What is the point? And because we insist on an answer, we end up with some really bad theology. Related to the idea of a thought experiment, the idea of which Carol Newsom attributes to science fiction author Ursula Le Guin, is the conviction that the book of Job represents a challenge to retributive justice view that we see presented earlier in the Bible and which unfortunately persists even today. That view goes like this: if you're good, you'll be blessed. If you're bad, you'll be punished. Sound familiar? See the problem here? Can you think of some exceptions? Keeping this challenge to the worldview of retributive justice in the front of our minds will help us to read Job well. And spoiler alert, Job was right. He was a man of integrity, but he expected God to act in the same manner that he, as a great patriarch, would have acted. He was holding God to the standards of his own moral integrity, never dreaming that his own perspective was limited. It makes me wonder, what does my integrity look like? What does your integrity look like? And can we acknowledge that we don't have the whole picture? No matter our age, our gender, our social status, education, financial situation, or life experience, can we acknowledge that others have different and often helpful perspectives? If we enter into this thought experiment together over the next several weeks, we just might end up transformed and able to acknowledge that our point of view is limited. Our understanding of God is limited. And we need each other, especially those with whom we disagree. May we learn to value these differences and honor the contributions they make to our families, our teams, and our community. Amen.